Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where in the world you may be right now. I'm Tom Palmer, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to Freedom Worldwide. My guest today is Professor William Easterly, a renowned economist who specializes in development, that is to say, the transition from poverty to wealth. His CV is very extensive, so I'll just mention his doctorate in economics from MIT, his work from 1985 to 2001 at the World Bank, his professorship at New York University, and his eye-opening books, starting with The Elusive Quest for Growth, Economist's Adventures and Misadventures in the Tropics. The second book, The White Man's Burden, Why the West's Efforts to Aid the Rest Have Done So Much Ill and So Little Good. And then his third book, The Tyranny of Experts, Economists, Dictators, and the Forgotten Rights of the Poor. And his next book is coming out later this year from Basic Books. It's called Violent Saviors, The West's Conquest of the Rest. Now, with the recent changes in US foreign aid practices, whether someone likes them or hates them, it means there needs to be some serious rethinking about how people in poor countries can move out of poverty. So welcome, Bill, to Freedom Worldwide.
Thank you very much. Pleasure to be here.
Well, you began to unravel the errors, and they're really big ones, colossal errors that caused a lot of harm around the world, of so much of development economics with your book, The Elusive Quest for Growth. And you noted the mistaken theory of capital fundamentalism. And you put it, the belief that increasing buildings and machineries is the fundamental determinant of growth. You noted that that was rejected by economists, but as you said, it had few doubters in the international financial institutions. So the theory was that all you had to do was to increase investment. And you did that by adding foreign aid, like a salt shaker, adding foreign aid to a country, and then you get growth and eventually mass affluence. Now, that's what I was taught when I took my first course at macroeconomics many decades ago. We read Walt Rostow's Stages of Growth. That turned out to be spectacularly wrong, yet it seems to still inform a lot of international foreign aid. Why is that?
The basic problem is the neglect of the role of incentives in economic development. There's this idea that, like you said, aid could just mechanically finance capital equipment, and that would automatically lead to growth. So, for example, in Ghana after independence, there was a huge aid program that supported the building of Akosombo Dam, a huge power generating dam in southern Ghana. And that was expected to make possible this aluminum industry in Ghana. But the problem with that, of course, is the investment climate in Ghana was so terrible, where under the Kwame Nkrumah regime, private investment was taxed and expropriated. A terrible atmosphere for private investors to want to invest in the future. And Ghana's subsequent history, this kept reiterating that again and again. The cocoa producers, where Ghana had been the leading exporter of cocoa in the world before the end of the colonial regime. When Nkrumah and his successors put severe taxes on cocoa exports, at one point, the cocoa exporters were only getting 6% of the world price. And so cocoa totally collapsed. So there was no aluminum industry. There was a collapse of the existing driving activity of cocoa exporting. And so when you dip aid into that environment, aid is just going to be misused as much as any of the rest of government funds were being misused under a regime of very high corruption and political patronage that paid no attention to the efficient allocation of capital across productive uses.
Well, after people sort of looked around, some people realized, well, that didn't work out. It was a colossal mess. And this happened in many other countries as well. So it looked, for a while, there was the big shift to institutions. That's what they need. They need the right institutions. But somehow the same mindset, which was, we're going to develop you by supplying you with institutions that are just like ours. We're going to copy them and just helicopter them onto you. And that didn't turn not too well either. So what was missing in that approach? Surely institutions matter. How did they mess it up?
As you said, institutions cannot be imposed by outside experts. They grow naturally, and over a long period of time, they evolve. And aid could actually make the quest for better institutions worse. USAID, for most of its history, has been mainly subordinate to US foreign policy objectives. So during the Cold War, USAID, its aid went to corrupt dictators. And that lasted through the end of the Cold War. And then shortly after the end of the Cold War began the war on terror, when USAID again directed aid to corrupt dictators, because corrupt dictators make very good allies, but they make very terrible development partners. So, for example, Uganda's President Yoweri Museveni got tons of U.S. aid and World Bank aid, partly because he was supporting the U.S. in fighting al-Shabaab in Somalia with Ugandan troops. But the climate, again, the investment climate in Uganda was terrible. He was a terrible oppressor, violating the rights of the poor. And so the effective aid in that environment is actually to make institutions worse rather than better.
Well, I'd like to point out for our viewers that you can post questions for Bill Easterly in the question box in your Zoom application on your computer or smartphone, and then we can discuss them toward the end of the discussion. So please feel free to add them now. You talked about Uganda. I'd like to read a passage in the book, The Tyranny of Experts, just very briefly. I think it was so powerful and it helped me to rethink this policy. You describe the farmers in Wood County in rural Northwest Ohio never saw it coming. The soldiers had arrived in the morning of Sunday, February 28, 2010, while the farmers were in church. Hearing gunshots, the farmers had rushed to their houses, which by then were already immersed in flames. And you describe just a horror. 20,000 farmers marched away at rifle point, a child dying in the fire that had been set by the soldiers. The people were expelled, told never to come back. This was going to be developed by a British company to grow timber and so on. You tell this story of a horror. And then you ask, well, is this story really true? It is true, except for one geographic detail. The events did not occur in Wood County, Ohio. They occurred in Mubende District, Uganda. And the World Bank had promoted the forestry project there to raise incomes, but those whose rights the bank had overlooked would not be among the beneficiaries. Now, if this really happened in Ohio, presumably people would be up in arms in the United States, outrageous. But because it was done to people in Uganda, it's just development policy. How is it that we've allowed that to happen?
Well, we really have a double standard in development policy. As you say, there would be outrage if that happened in Ohio. But when it happened in Uganda, even though the story was reported on the front page of the New York Times, there was a noticeable lack of outrage. I actually somewhat mischievously posted on a blog I was writing at that time and a clock where I was going to start the clock at the time the World Bank project happened and the story was reported in the New York Times, and ask how long would it take for the World Bank or any other aid actor to do an investigation of what happened there and move into Uganda and try to get some resolution or compensation for the victims of that terrible project. So I started the clock, and as you might guess, the clock is still running today. It never happened. There never was an investigation. The World Bank did a sort of whitewash where it sort of blamed everything on the government of Uganda, but did no investigation of the World Bank's own role and why was the World Bank itself involved in supporting this project. So, and in the rest of the development establishment, there was also sort of no outrage, no calls for an investigation. That seems really sad to me that we care so little about the rights of poor people, and that we have this kind of really distorted stereotype of poor people, that they only care about their material well-being and whether they have enough food and shelter. and don't care about their rights. And my experience throughout my career is that's just totally wrong. Poor people, like everyone else, care very much about their individual rights.
Well, and as I've understood it, also this issue of agency, that the development organizations treat them as things to be moved about, not
Yeah.
as centers of activity, not as the origin of choices and plans and thoughts, just things. And the development people can move them around, reconfigure them as if they were inanimate objects. Does that roughly capture, you think, what's going
Yeah,
on?
very much. I mean, this forced resettlement that happened in Uganda, that's very much that mindset. These people are in the way. We're just going to move them out of the way to get more development. It's as if the objective of development were really to develop the land rather than the people, which is just ridiculous. The land doesn't care if it's developed or not. The people care very much about whether they're developed and whether they have rights and to consent to their own progress. So, that very much is the mindset. And just sort of disrespect for the agency and autonomy of poor people, letting them decide what their development is going to look like. I mean, one kind of somewhat silly example of that is development experts sort of criticize poor people a lot when they spend some of their scarce resources on weddings and funerals or tea and snacks. It's called wasteful expenditure. And, there's a lot of fears that if you give money to poor people, they will make these bad choices. But, they have the same right as you or I. They want to have celebrate a wedding, pay respects at a funeral, have tea and snacks. That's just ridiculous that we project our own desires and plans on other people and expect them, to do what we think they should do and even force them to do it.
I remember Polly Hill in her book, Development Economics on Trial, pointed out that investment by poor people in a corn grinding machine had been considered by international experts as wasteful expenditure. But she said, women will walk for 2 days with a sack of corn on their head to the corn grinding machine so they could come back with it ground. That tells you something about how valuable it is to them not to
Mm-hmm.
have to do that by hand.
Mm-hmm.
But for the outside experts, it was wasteful. For
Mm-hmm.
the people who lived there, it was a really important expenditure.
Mm-hmm.
Now, you're also interested in the history of thinking about development. And who are the ones that you think basically got it right or had the key insights over the last couple of 100 years?
Yeah, well, that's what I've been working on. That's I put into the newest book, the Violent Saviors book, because there's sort of this unheralded role for pro-market economists throughout the last couple of centuries to sort of protest colonial conquests as being very much one of the most terrible examples of combination of coercion and paternalism. That we have the right to conquer you because we can develop you better than you can develop yourself. Or maybe even we conquer you and don't care about you, or we can develop the land that you occupy better than you can yourself. This happened with Native Americans in the US. And that's just that's very much neglecting this demand that people have, not only for their material well-being, but they have a demand for freedom. They have a demand for self-determination, for agency, for dignity. And that is shown very much on, how vociferous the resistance to colonialism was. It's also shown by the liberal thinkers who are very much aware of this. Adam Smith doesn't get enough credit for actually condemning very much the West conquest of the rest and calling for equal rights of nations and calling for international free trade that would allow everyone to consensually participate in development. For him, the alternative to conquest was commerce, free trade. And that theme was followed up very much by his successors, some of them not well known, some of them better known. There's a free market economist named William Graham Sumner in the late 19th century that protested the American conquest of the Philippines. Ludwig von Mises protested colonialism in the 20s in his book Liberalism. More recently, in our times, P.T. Bauer and Milton Friedman very much put freedom as alternative to the planned forced development that was happening at that time. And Amartya Sen, in a more equivocal way, did make a case for development as freedom. That freedom is not an end, just an end to development. It's an end in itself, that people have a demand for freedom and agency and self-determination and dignity.
You know, it's interesting. I read recently Helen Rosenblatt's book on the lost history of liberalism, and she talks about these free trade liberals and she poo-poos them. She's not so important. Don't listen to them. Later in the book, having dismissed them, she says, oh, liberals were the forefront of the anti-colonial, anti-imperialist movement, but she doesn't name any names. And of course,
Yeah,
the reason is it was all those free trade, free market advocates that were the heroes,
yeah,
and that would be
yeah,
awkward for her.
yeah. Also, John Stuart Mill, in favor of free labor against slavery. There's, just Harriet Martineau, also prominent in the abolitionist movement. That's the lost history of liberalism. Is really, how much liberalism contributed to an anti-slavery, anti-colonial viewpoint. And sadly, we identify those viewpoints today with the left and sort of let the left capture those issues. When, we should be recognizing much more what an important role liberal economists in the past and liberal economists still today could play in realizing that demand for self-determination.
Well, a key term in the past few decades to describe the bundle of policies that have been promoted by some of the institutions we've mentioned, World Bank and IMF and so on, is the Washington Consensus. How did it get that name, and what are its key components?
Yeah, so the content of the Washington Consensus is actually pretty decent from the standpoint of sensible economics. Don't have super high inflation, don't have crazy taxes on trade that destroy trade. Uh, privatize extremely inefficient state-owned enterprises. The sort of the mantra of liberalize, privatize, stabilize was sensible, very sensible. But the problem was the word Washington. The arrogance of Washington experts that thought they could sort of parachute into countries in need of the Washington Consensus aid and tell them what to do. And that backfired, because no one likes to be told what to do by outside foreigners. Like in Russia, where I was working in the early 1990s, there was a flood of Western economists and lawyers trying to tell Russians how to run their economy, how to run their society. And I think the backlash against that, the sense of humiliation of that, had a lot to do with the rise of Putin in Russia.
Yeah, understood. So do you think there are some pros and cons, but part of the big con was this was implemented by self-styled experts based in Washington at the World Bank, IMF, USAID, and other institutions. Tell us a bit more about your more recent research and what you've learned that has added to your understanding of the process of development.
Well, the very simplest thing I've learned is just that man does not live by bread alone. That our obsession with GDP, with per capita income, with any measure of material income, has really led to huge distortions in how development has happened over time. During the colonial era, it did support, really brutal conquests that were obviously not about development, but about the self-interest of Westerners, like the way, King Leopold in Belgium, tortured the Congo to get profits from rubber exports. And that was sort of, endorsed by development thinkers, that this was supposedly in the name of progress. And it's, the critics of that approach, again, offered free trade as an alternative to that. The Congolese could have just, owned the rubber trees and freely participated in exporting rubber to the rest of the world. But, that we lost that perspective in development. We kept our obsession with material income, which material GDP did increase a lot in the Congo under King Leopold, but it was not a benefit to the people of the Congo. So there's just so many examples like that over and over again that tell us that our obsession with GDP is really a fundamental mistake, that we really need another condition for successful development that defines what development is. That development is when people consent to their own development, when people consent to their own progress. And if they don't, then raising material GDP is not making people better off.
Well, that makes sense. So it's pretty clear that there's a case for reducing foreign aid, possibly eliminating it. That is to say, governmental aid. But how do you think it ought to be done?
Yeah, I mean, that's another area where the arrogance of economists, including my own arrogance, we have to watch out for. Just because economists identify a destination that would be a good destination, doesn't mean they know how to get there. And the problem, as with shock therapy in Russia, we thought it was so obvious you just jump from communism to capitalism, but we really didn't know how to get there. Just smashing all the factories in Russia, this led to a huge recession that again, led to some of the unhappy subsequent developments in Russia. And I think, in our context of aid, just kind of, blowing up U.S. aid, just demolishing with the sledgehammer U.S. aid, that's not the way to jump from where we are now to an equilibrium that I think would be a good equilibrium with lower aid and a much more emphasis on freedom. But taking a sledgehammer is not the way to go. I mean, a liberal society, does things, with consent, with deliberation, with democratic procedures and the rule of law, approval by democratic consultations in Congress and by the citizens. You don't just blow things up and expect things to get better. You want to honor contracts. I think liberals' instinct tends to be for gradualism rather than shock programs that just blow everything up.
I was reminded when I was in Moscow in the 1980s, free market economist was writing sort of secretly and could only become open about it later, Boris Pinsker, and he put it very neatly. He said, it's not difficult to turn an aquarium into fish soup, but we have the job of turning fish soup into an aquarium, which is rather more difficult.
That's a great metaphor. Yeah. I remember an economist that I admired said something in Russia that, if we can plan the reforms exactly, then we could have planned the economy exactly.
Yeah, exactly.
You don't want to have central planning of reforms any more than you want to have central planning of economics.
Now, I should note that people who are interested in an alternative to foreign aid that's actually helping people to escape poverty is actively advanced by Atlas Network. And if you'd like to be a part of helping people to escape poverty, you can become a part of Atlas Network with a donation. A donation of $25 or more will get you a subscription to our magazine, Freedom's Champion, which offers inspiring case studies of how freedom delivers the goods and how our partners are securing freedom, the rule of law, and limited government in every corner of the globe, from Ohio to Brazil, Indonesia to Tanzania, Lithuania to Syria. Now, a question, Bill, will your upcoming book offer an alternative to governmental aid? I should note it's already available for pre-ordering. I've ordered my copy. I'm really looking forward to it. But tell us about your new book, Violent Saviors.
Yeah, so, another interesting thing about liberals is, in a way, their contribution is mainly negative. Maybe that's one reason they're not as successful in always winning the intellectual arguments. They put forward principles that are mainly negative. Don't conquer, don't steal, don't expropriate, don't kill. And if you're following those negative principles is what leads to the emergence of a prosperous society. But to intellectuals, it's not as satisfying because it doesn't put intellectuals in charge. They're not the ones in charge in a liberal society. What's in charge is individuals are in charge of themselves, operating in free markets. In a liberal democracy, the citizens are in charge, constrained by the rights of the citizens. And so, I often find myself in this uncomfortable position of giving these negative recommendations, and people say, well, what's your alternative? But the kind of society that we want is not one where somebody like me dictates the alternative. It's one where we honor the principles of liberal democracy and free markets. And that out of that organically emerges the solutions that poor people and poor countries find for themselves, not the solutions that I think that I'm going to dictate to anyone. I think all of us economists, both anti-market and pro-market economists, just need a lot more humility than we have now, in recognition that we are not in charge. The goal is to have poor people in charge of themselves.
Now, you put a lot of stress on your work on the liberating effect on billions of people of, as you call it, the surge in global trade. So just briefly, what do you make of President Trump's imposition yesterday of just a staggering array of extremely high tariffs? I mean, we've never seen anything like that in our lifetimes, which he falsely claimed are somehow reciprocal, but as far as I can tell, they're calculated based on not on the tariffs of other countries, but a weird formula. Take the trade deficit the US has with a particular country and divide it by the country's exports to the US, and then you get something that is supposedly their trade barrier. It just seems, I don't know how to put it, unhinged. What do you think is likely to come of this?
This is really sad what's happening now with the basically the smashing of globalization and global trade. And frankly, all sides on the political spectrum have some guilt in this process. The progressives, have been protesting for 30 years the globalization and what they called neoliberalism, which maybe neoliberalism had some bad aspects, but it was mainly just let global trade and globalization happen. And that led to, globalization led to huge benefits for both the rich countries and poor countries. The greatest decline in poverty that we've ever seen in economic history. World poverty dropped from about 40% for extreme poverty to less than 10% over the past 40 years. And that's now all under threat from this crazy backlash against free trade that's happening on both the right and the left. An economist, I feel like we've really done a bad job kind of conveying the simple insights of mutual gains from trade. It's not the zero-sum game that the current people in power think it is. It's a game in which both sides benefit. And when you destroy that, both sides are going to lose. What's going to be reciprocal now is we're going to have reciprocal losses. It's like saying, well, I don't like what you're doing to me, so I'm going to impose a loss on myself. And that's just crazy.
Now, our Atlas network is a network. It's not an organization or a franchise. And we have independent partners, and they do work identifying local problems with their own local knowledge and expertise. They live there, and then finding what's the problem and what are the paths towards improvement. So in Philippines, our partners, Foundation for Economic Freedom, changed what were called rural agricultural patents, which are almost serfdom in a way for farmers, to title and fee simple, normal property rights, buy, sell, treat it as property, liberated 2.5 million families. In Burundi, the Center for Development and Economics in the Great Lakes region got rid of the requirement to have a passport to do cross-border trade. It's very expensive. They get filled up with stamps. You need a new one. And the consequences were disastrous for the traders, most of whom are women. And if they crossed at night, they'd be sexually assaulted by predatory gangs. They just gave them, instead, the government gave them a border crossing card, in, out, no problem, do it during the day. Huge increases in the incomes of the traders and lower prices for consumers. It's win-win. So that's what our partners tried to do instead of being dictated from abroad. Do you have any particular advice for partners who are watching this right now? And we have a very global audience.
Again, I think, different people have different roles to play. But I think one of the important roles that is most neglected is just promotion of good ideas. I think, it was Keynes who said, the some despot is, just operating in the failed ideas of some bad economists. And I think it's, important for economists who have that training, like me, and people in the classical liberal tradition that have the instincts, why freedom is desirable in itself. The most important thing we can do is just promote those ideas and, argue for those ideas and enter the debate around those ideas. And I think the part we've neglected the most is just the case for equal rights, that everyone has these rights to free markets and liberal political rights that have been set out in the liberal tradition. And we're not going to discriminate between, by gender or by race or by nationality or by continent. And I think that's a cause that classical liberals have kind of neglected, and could really expand the appeal of classical liberalism to embrace that cause much more forcefully.
It's a cause of justice. So
The
we
cause
have,
of equal justice. Yes.
that's right, equal justice. Everybody has rights. Everybody matters,
Yeah.
not just elites or the ones in the urban centers or the people who hold power. We have quite a number of questions here. So from Switzerland, Christopher Hartwell says, we know that institutions matter and that property rights matter most of all. What can foreign aid do to help build effective and protected property rights?
Yeah. Well, again, sadly, for the appeal to the general audience, I think I have mainly a negative thing to offer, which is, at least don't have aid support the oppressive regime that denies property rights and oppresses, the citizens, taking away both their political and economic rights. So, aid has sadly played the role of enabling and supporting those anti-freedom policies. So, which is, again, mainly for foreign policy reasons, because aid is captured very much by the foreign policy establishment. So I think aid can just do an about face on that one. Or if it's incapable of doing an about face, then that's more of a case for just ending aid.
Okay, and from India, Louis Miranda writes, what are examples, if any, where foreign aid was useful? Can aid sometimes be required for a limited time to help people step onto the first leg of the ladder?
I certainly don't think that foreign aid is just universally an enormous, catastrophic, universal failure. There are some bright spots, and not surprisingly, they're in areas where markets don't work as well because they're public goods, like health, especially, is I think the area where foreign aid has worked the best. So vaccines are partially a private good, but partly a public good, because you're taking your vaccine affects other people through contagion. And so, aid has had some successes fighting infant mortality by making vaccines and antibiotics and anti-malarial drugs and malaria bed nets, and spraying insecticide on the walls of houses to fight malaria. Those things have had some success. Those, those are areas where I think that's another reason why you don't want to just smash aid without any discrimination. You do want to kind of recognize some things may have worked better than others.
From Uganda, John Mugabe writes this, we have a dilemma with the World Bank funded project. Why is World Bank development projects ending up not lifting the poor from poverty, but rewarding the elites? We have case stories here in Uganda.
Well, Uganda, I'm sure you know much more about Ugandan situations than I do. What strikes me is the way that Museveni has attracted so much support over the years from the US and from the aid establishment. And that's the sense in which aid has not been a constructive force. And in that environment, it's not surprising that aid gets captured by the elites in Uganda. because in a sense, the donors don't really care whether it's captured by the elites or goes to the poor. They don't care enough because they're, the rationale that they sort of give into is that aid goes to Uganda because it's a U.S. or U.K. priority for it to do so for foreign policy reasons.
So I've been in a number of countries where I've witnessed that. You tend to find all the big, beautiful, white, expensive SUVs at the nicest places in town. That's where all the development officers are. And they have a normal tendency to interact with other elites with whom they have more in common, speaking a common language, university educated, and so on. And it's not much of a surprise that people who could manipulate the system to rise to the top are probably better at manipulating the foreign aid system to their benefit. Well, so we have Deborah Bizarria says, Professor Easterly, I really appreciate how your work brings attention to the risks of top-down solutions that'll ignore local knowledge and agency, thinking about contexts where institutions are still fragile or where clientelism plays a role. What do you see as the most effective way to foster inclusive, locally driven, evidence-based policies, the kind that actually stick because they're owned from within? And do you think there's any room for nudging in a way that supports local voice rather than bypassing it?
Yeah, I think it's important for aid to support sort of local people on the ground as they're trying to achieve reforms, and they have much better knowledge and expertise and much better incentives to do things that are benevolent and beneficial. So that's point number one. Just support local actors. And I think the aid has tried to do that already, but it's done so in a way where the outside aid basically remains in control, and they have sort of token local partners that don't have enough autonomy to actually, be in charge. There's not an easy solution as usual.
We have a question from Brian Chang, who's in London and Singapore. He says, hello, Bill. We've been corresponding.
Hey, Brian. Good to see you.
He says, my question is as follows. The world of development is now quite different since the last few decades, where ambitious, large-scale aid programs have been used by Western countries. Are foreign aid programs, especially of the ambitious sort, still the dominant paradigm today? Even Washington consensus is discredited by most. In fact, in the development literature, there's a shift towards micro-level interventions, pilot programs at localized scales, and the use of RCTs, randomized controlled trials, to evaluate these small-scale programs. If true, the concern is no longer that of large-scale foreign aid and its attendant problems, though we may still detect an element of paternalism in the newer development theories. What do you think?
Yeah, well, I mean, this shift towards the micro randomized control trials and so on sort of shows you, again, that the old paradigm was indeed bankrupt, that the aid critics sort of won the argument, that transformative aid was just not happening, was not succeeding. And so in a way, the randomized trials are a welcome development because they're a much more rigorous evaluation than in the old days when aid would just, evaluate itself and say, I am doing a good job and put out propaganda. That's a welcome development. But, I think the downside of randomized control trials is they do still sort of seem to promise that they are the solution to development. And that's really implausible. No country, as my good friend Lant Pritchett has pointed out, no country has ever developed based on randomized trials. There's no example of that happening. So, find that you're rigorously evaluating ways that you can help, a few 100,000 people or 1 million people at a time. That's great. You're doing some good, but you can't pretend that this is, somehow substituting for the old regime, the old paradigm, and offering a way to overall development or overall long-run escape from poverty. It's not going to do that. It's not doing that.
So understood. I'd like to then turn to a question from Indonesia. Dinda Mukhtar asks, she says, Professor, would you think the end of USAID is an example of doing development differently, which promotes more economic freedom and empowering the beneficiaries? Or is it more of President Trump's economic, political policies refocusing the US foreign aid policy to more focus on domestic policies? That's the first question. And what are your comments on the impacts of the US ending foreign aid, including through USAID on development issues such as HIV, AIDS, sustainability, et cetera? Will it reduce aid dependency towards foreign aid?
Well, yes, it's a good thing to reduce dependency. But again, you want to have some discrimination. The program on HIV/AIDS was one of the big successes in the history of aid. And to just pull the plug on that with no discrimination between that and other types of aid, like agricultural aid that did fail really spectacularly, you're just throwing away things that are working and that are really helping a lot of people without discrimination. And so, I can't be in favor of that path towards, reducing dependency, even though reducing dependency is a good thing.
So we have a question from Susan Boulan. How would you manage the goal for a project to bring development and protecting rights? For example, in the Philippines, there's a project to build a dam to provide a source of water for the greater population, but it will affect the natives in the area who may lose their land. If you were a policymaker, how would you manage such a situation?
Yeah, I mean, I think I could speak to maybe the role of the outside actors in this process. That kind of thing, first of all, should be settled internally by, and allowing the victims who are being resettled by the dam, their democratic rights to participate in this process and receive just compensation, or maybe block the project if it's really not a good idea. But the role of outside actors is just to step back and not support that kind of project when it doesn't have adequate consultation with those being affected.
We have time for just one quick more question because we like to end on time. So Parth Shah from India, and there are more questions. I wish we could get to all of them. But from India, there's so many stories of atrocities under the name of development. From Ghana, Uganda mentioned now, the play pump, experiments of Jeffrey Sachs. We don't see any of these stories becoming part of the folklore, unlike those of robber barons, et cetera, used by the socialist left. Why is that so, and what can be done about it?
Yeah, I mean, I think aid has benefited a lot from this instinct that, yes, very rich people really want to help very poor people, and they're sort of desperate to find some positive story where that is possible and that is happening. And, that's kept us from being kind of very clear-eyed and realistic about what really is possible and what's not possible, and also from being clear-eyed about who is going to make this happen. The historical examples are very much that people are much better at ending their own poverty than having outsiders in poverty for them. And the outsiders may find that very discouraging to be told that. But the best thing outsiders can do is just support those ideas, those good ideas, and those good values that recognize the equal rights of all people, rich and poor, and whether in the West or the rest, every ethnic group and race, to be in charge of their own development, to be able to consent to their own progress, and not have some outsiders impose their idea of progress on them.
That's a great note to end on. We have more questions we can't get to. What I'd like to recommend is for everyone to buy Bill Easterly's books. They're really well written. I can't say that of a lot of development economics. They're engaging and they're eye-opening. I learned so much, Bill, from your books. I'm looking forward to the new ones, so go online and order these books now. Our time is up. I look forward to seeing people at the next Freedom Worldwide, and until then, stay free.